All right, let's go. Number 10. The cave with two kinds of pit. Above a perennial spring in the hills behind Salernez in the Var, there is a cave called Fontbrégoua. It sits 400 meters up. It stands 30 meters above water that has never stopped running. People used it on and off for thousands of years. They left the floor packed with the debris of Neolithic life. Sheep, wild boar, deer, broken pottery. Jean Corton dug there from the 1970s onward. In one level, he found something that did not look like a rubbish layer at all. It was a set of 18 small clusters of bone, each one apparently a single episode of butchery, tipped into its own shallow hollow and covered over. Some of the hollows held one domestic sheep. Some held several wild animals. Some held people. One of them is cataloged as H3. It is a scrape in this cave floor, 80 centimeters long, 40 wide, and 15 deep. It contained 6 human beings, taken apart. Lying in with them were 8 fragments of 2 polished limestone bracelets that had been deliberately snapped. There was also one small stone axe. In 1986, Paula Villa and 7 colleagues published those hollows in the journal Science. The first thing the paper does is concede the problem. Cannibalism, they wrote, is a claim put forward repeatedly for prehistoric sites and so poorly supported by objective evidence. Later, more critical reviews almost invariably reject it. They were describing their own discipline's habit of embarrassment. Then they set about fixing it. Their method was simple, and it reorganized the field. Fontbrégoua holds animals that people definitely ate in the same deposit cut up by the same hands. So compare the two. 41.7% of the human upper arm bones carried butchery marks. For the animal upper arm bones, the figure was 40.8. Of 33 distinct varieties of cut mark identified on the human remains, 23 of them, 70%, turned up on the matching bones of animals. The human skulls carried skinning marks running along the midline in the position they occupy on a skinned deer. Every long bone of both species had been broken open the same way for marrow, and both were thrown away identically in the same kind of hollow on the same floor. The obvious objection arrived quickly. In 1989, Michael Pickering argued that these bones record a secondary burial rite. He drew his comparison from documented Australian Aboriginal practices, where bodies were stripped, disarticulated, and put down again, and nobody ate anything. It is a serious argument, and it haunts every entry in this countdown: cleaning a corpse for reburial and cleaning a corpse for a meal. Leave marks we cannot always tell apart. The problem is, Pickering brought ethnography, not bones. He offered no bone data from Australia and no animal comparison at all. Villa's reply, published in 1992, laid down 3 tests that any secondary burial explanation has to pass. It has to account for the marrow fractures. It has to explain why cut marks fall in the same places at the same frequencies, on people and on game. And it has to explain the identical discard. At Fontbrégoua, none of the 3 has been met. A redating program published in 2010 placed the human deposits between roughly 5,400 and 4,800 years before the Common Era. 2 of the pits are contemporary. The third is centuries older. That is the unsettling part, because this was not one terrible night. The cave was used this way abandoned, and used this way again by people who had never met the first lot. What Fontbrégoua produced was not really a story. It was an examination paper. Put the humans beside the animals from the same floor mark for mark and break for break, and see whether the 2 piles can be told apart. Every site we are about to look at has been made to sit that exam. Very few of them return a comfortable result. Number 9. El Mirador Cave. There is a kind of damage that only one process makes. It took an experiment to prove it. When a broken piece of bone is boiled for a long time inside a coarse ceramic pot, it moves. It knocks and rubs against the gritty inner wall of the vessel, and the projecting broken ends wear down into facets that are smooth, rounded, glassy, and slightly translucent. Tim White described the effect in his 1992 study of an assemblage from Mancos Canyon in Colorado. He did not simply assert it. He cooked bone in clay pots himself, produced the polish, and matched what he had made against what came out of the ground. He also issued a warning that has caught people out since. A pot-polished fragment looks enough like a deliberately manufactured bone tool that a careless analyst will catalog it as one. The term is pot polish. Hold on to it because of the site it leads to next. El Mirador is a cave in the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain in the same limestone hills that hold the most important early human sites in Europe. For most of its later history, it was a sheepfold. Herders drove flocks in, pinned them, burnt out the dung to keep the parasites down, and moved on. The result is a stack of layers running from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age. In 2007, Isabel Cacares, Marina Lozano, and Palmyra Salati published an assemblage from a small pit in one of the Bronze Age levels. It held the remains of 6 people, one of them a child of about 8. The bones carried cut marks concentrated at muscle attachments and along the sutures of the skull. They carried percussion damage from marrow extraction. They carried human tooth marks, and their broken edges were rounded and polished and see-through at the rim. Those 6 had been jointed, stripped, and boiled roughly 4,500 years ago. What makes El Mirador extraordinary is what showed up when they dug deeper. In 2025, Saladier and colleagues published a second deposit from the same cave in the Neolithic levels underneath, and modeled it as a single rapid event around 5,600 years ago. 11 people this time. At least 3 children, 2 juveniles, 4 adults. 132 bones with cut marks, 245 with deliberate breakage, 157 bearing human tooth marks, and 585 specimens carrying pot polish. 585 out of one deposit. It is the closest thing we have to a photograph. Cut marks record a body taken apart. Percussion records bones opened for what was inside them. Polish records a pot on a fire, held there long enough for the contents to rub themselves smooth against the clay. But here is where the honest limit has to be stated, because it applies from now to the end of the list. Polish proves cooking. It does not prove swallowing. We have never recovered a stomach from any of these sites, and boiling a body is not the same act as eating one, even if it is very hard to think of a third reason to do it. The 2 El Mirador events are separated by about 1,000 years. Different economy, different pottery, different world. The Neolithic group were farmers. The Bronze Age group were herders, driving animals into a cave their distant predecessors had used for something else entirely. Neither group left any indication that they knew what the other had done. That is the genuinely disturbing shape of it. The cave did not remember, and there was nothing to warn anybody. It simply held both deposits stacked one above the other, waiting for somebody to notice that the same room had been used for the same purpose twice. Number 8. Maszycka Cave. The human bones from Maszycka came out of the ground in the 1880s. They sat in a Polish collection for well over a century. Curators examined them, argued, then shelved them. The full account of what is on them was not published until February 2025. The cave is in the Prodnik Valley, near Krakow, inside what is now a national park. The material belongs to the Magdalenian, the reindeer hunting culture that pushed back into Central Europe as the ice sheets pulled north. They carried fine blades, bone points, and spear throwers, and they left painted caves behind. They weren't marginal folks scraping by. They were the most technically accomplished hunters in the world then. Direct radiocarbon dates, taken from the human bone itself, put a mandible between 18,586 and 18,184 years ago. A frontal bone falls in the same window. Francesc Marguineda's Palmyra Saladia and their co-authors re-examined 53 specimens. 36 of them, just under 68%, carry deliberate human modification. 31 carry cut marks. For comparison, the equivalent figure at Gough's Cave in Somerset, which is the benchmark for this kind of assemblage, is around 65%. The marks aren't random. This is the bit that turns a pile of bones into a record of what somebody actually did with their hands. On the skulls, there are groups of cuts running parallel to the sagittal suture. That's the seam down the crown of the head. That is scalping. Then, there are notches struck along the lambdoid, the coronal, and the sagittal sutures themselves. Those seams are the natural weak lines of the human cranium. They're where the plates of the vault meet and haven't fused into a single dome. Somebody knew where they were. They worked around the seams and levered the vault apart to reach the brain. It is a small, precise, unsettling piece of anatomical knowledge, and it is present in a cave 18,000 years ago. Below the neck, the pattern shifts to food. Percussion pits on a humerus, notches on two femurs and a fibula. Long bones open for marrow in the way any large animal's leg is opened. There were 10 of them, 6 adults and 4 juveniles, one of the children about 6 years old. But here is where the assemblage says something the individual marks cannot. The human remains were not set aside anywhere. They weren't placed, covered, grouped, or separated. They were mixed straight into the ordinary occupation debris of the cave among the stone tools, animal bones, and the discarded rubbish of people who kept living there. The distinction that every human society draws between a body and a leftover was simply not applied, and that absence is more disturbing than any of the cut marks. The 2025 team read the age profile as a family unit and read the whole deposit as the outcome of an intergroup confrontation. Late glacial Central Europe was filling up as the climate improved, and populations separated by ice for millennia were meeting. That is a reading of context rather than of bone, and we should label it as one. There is also an earlier reanalysis of this same material published in 2017 by Jörg Orschiet, Thomas Terberger, and colleagues, which emphasized the selective treatment of skulls within a Magdalenian mortuary tradition. 3 of that team are authors on the 2025 paper as well. The disagreement is not between rival camps. It is a discipline arguing with an earlier version of itself over the same shelf of bones. One detail belongs to neither reading. Maszycka has no human tooth marks on it at all. Whatever else was done to these 10 people, nobody in that cave gnawed them. The authors note this plainly because the sites that follow do have those marks, and the difference matters. So, what we are left with is a family. 6 grown-ups and 4 children were taken apart by somebody who knew the skull's architecture, and their bones were swept into the flint chips and reindeer bone on the cave floor, while people kept living there afterward. Number 7. Baume Moula-Guercy. The cave opens in a limestone cliff 80 meters above the west bank of the Rhône, about 10 kilometers south of Valence. Alban de Fleur excavated it through the 1990s. And in October 1999, he and 4 co-authors published Layer 15 in the journal Science. Layer 15 belongs to the last interglacial, somewhere around 100 to 120,000 years ago, when hippopotamus lived in European rivers. The date is not a guess. A dating program published in 2016 ran radiocarbon argon-uranium series and electron spin resonance across the sequence, and put a uranium series measurement directly on one of the Neanderthal teeth. Layer 15 contained 78 Neanderthal bone specimens from 6 individuals, 2 adults, 2 adolescents of about 15 or 16, 2 children of about 6 or 7. Every skull was broken open. Every limb bone was broken open. The hands and the feet were left whole. That single observation is the reason this site is famous. Hands and feet are a mass of small bones with almost no marrow in them and nothing to gain from breaking them. They were not broken. Everything with marrow in it was. Whoever did this was not destroying bodies in a rage. They were processing them, and they stopped exactly where the return stopped being worth the effort. There is something quietly terrifying about that restraint, and we should not soften it. The finer marks fill in the rest. The temporalis muscle, the broad fan of muscle over the side of the skull that closes the jaw, had been cut away from the younger individuals. There are cut marks on the inner surface of a mandible in the position that means a tongue was taken out. The Achilles tendon and the deep flexor tendons of the toes had been severed at the joints. The long bones had been fractured with a hammerstone against a stone anvil, which is the standard technique for any large animal. There were no carnivore marks on any of it. Nothing was burnt. This was done entirely by people indoors with flint. Red deer in the same layer had been treated the same way. Around half the Neanderthal bones carry cut marks. For the deer, the figure is roughly 26%, which means the people were handled more thoroughly than the game was. In 2019, de Fleur returned with a full explanation. The last interglacial had warmed, rapidly redistributed. The vegetation scattered the animals and crashed the Neanderthal population of Western Eurasia, leaving small groups clinging on in refuges. He counted 10 sites of that age in the whole region. Starving Neanderthals ate each other. Except that a rebuttal came the following year from Ludovic Slimak, and Christopher Nicholson and Slimak's name is on the 1999 paper that announced the cannibalism in the first place. Their objection is arithmetic. They document around 85 sites of that age, not 10, which removes the population crash. The layer produced only 227 stone artifacts, which is nowhere near enough tooling for repeated large-scale butchery. The problem is the deer. Layer 15 holds a dozen or more species of hoofed animal, including horse, ibex roe deer, reindeer, and giant deer, and hardly any of them carry cut marks at all. A group in real trouble strips everything it can reach. This one did not. It stripped the people instead. Then there is the number that undercuts the hunger explanation everywhere it appears. And it is horrifying in the plainest way. James Cole calculated the calorific value of a human body in 2017. The commonly consumed parts of an adult male come to about 126,000 calories. Applied to Moula-Guercy, the 6 people in layer 15 are under 2 days of food for a band of 25 adults. 2 days for 6 of their own. So the evidence for what was done here is about as strong as this subject gets. The explanation that used to hold has quietly fallen apart. We had an explanation, and we no longer have one. What is left in that cave above the Rhone is 6 people. 2 of them small children, opened and stripped by somebody who knew precisely where the marrow was, and could not be bothered with their hands. Number 6. The bones they used as tools. In the Troisième cavern at Goyet, in the Belgian province of Namur, archaeologists found a Neanderthal femur. It has 2 worn patches on it. They are retouching zones. When a flint edge goes blunt, people press and strike it against something harder than skin and softer than stone. Bone really is about as ideal a material for that job as you'll find. The tool leaves a dense scatter of short marks on the retoucher. After long use, those marks overlap and deepen into a visible worn area. 3 Neanderthal shin bones from the same cave carry identical wear. There are 5 working surfaces across 4 bones. On 2 of them, the marks lie one over another, which means the object was picked up and used again and again over time. At least 3 different individuals supplied those 4 bones. Both the makers and the tools were literally cut from those same bodies. Goyet was the first site anywhere to yield more than 1 Neanderthal bone used as a retoucher. That's an extraordinary thing for a cave to hold. Hélène Rougier and her co-authors published the Goyet material in 2016 in Scientific Reports. 99 Neanderthal remains were radiocarbon dated directly to roughly between 40,500 and 45,500 years ago. That places them at the end of the Neanderthal record in Northern Europe. 32% of the specimens carry cut marks. 21% carry impact notches. 10% carry percussion pits. The truly disturbing part is how legible the sequence is. On the upper limbs, the cut marks sit at the joints, which is disarticulation. On the lower limbs, they run along the shafts, which is defleshing. On the ribs, they appear on both faces, which is evisceration and the opening of the chest. There are marks on a mandible beside the condyle, where a butcher cuts to take a jaw off a head. Horse and reindeer from the same deposit were processed by the same steps in the same order. Goyet is not an isolated case. At El Cedrón in Asturias, 13 Neanderthals were recovered from a chamber the excavators named the Tunnel of Bones, dated to around 49,000 years ago. Ancient DNA showed they were one social group. The adult men shared maternal lineages, and the adult women did not, which describes a community where the men stayed and the women arrived from elsewhere. That reading has been challenged on the grounds that a very small, isolated population can produce the same pattern by accident. And we should take the challenge seriously. What is not in doubt is the inbreeding. 17 congenital anomalies were recorded across the group, and 4 of the 13 were born with a split in the topmost vertebra of the neck. 3 generations of one extended family, physically marked by isolation, taken apart together in a single event. And about 25 kilometers from Goyet, at Spy in the same region, and the same handful of millennia 2 Neanderthal adults appear to have been buried. One was recovered as a near-complete skeleton, lying in a contracted position, protected quickly enough that the bones were never scattered. Same population, same century, near enough. One group put its dead in the ground, curled up, and another took its dead apart and sharpened flint on their legs. We are looking at one people, with two entirely different ideas of what a corpse is. But here is where a paper, published in 2025, changes what the Goyet assemblage is about. Largely the same research group ran genetic sexing and sulfur isotopes across the specimens, raised the count to 6 individuals, and found something the bones alone had hidden. 4 of the 6 are female adults or adolescents. The other 2 are immature males. The women are short with unusually light limb bones. And the sulfur values say none of them grew up locally. They all came from the same region, and it was not this one. That is not a demographic that dies naturally. The authors report it as statistically unlikely under every natural mortality model they tested, and they read the deposit as the aftermath of a raid. Outsiders taken, mostly women, brought back and consumed. The bones are still in Belgium, still cataloged, still carrying their retouched scars. What none of them can tell us is what the people at Goyet believed they were doing when they picked up a stranger's thigh bone to sharpen a blade. The act survives in perfect detail. The meaning of it does not survive at all. Number 5. The enclosure at Herxheim. In 1996, a construction project outside the village of Herxheim in the Palatinate in southwestern Germany triggered a rescue excavation. Part of the site was destroyed before anyone could reach it. What the archaeologists reached was a ditched enclosure belonging to the linear pottery culture, the first farming society of Central Europe, and the ditches were full of people, not buried, deposited. The counting has never settled. The range itself is the story. One estimate from the mid-2000s put it at a minimum of 450 individuals. The figure most often quoted is around 500, calculated from skull fragments alone. The site's own synthesis volume raised it above 600. And because only about half the enclosure has ever been dug, the specialists who studied the bone in most detail projected the full total at more than 1,000. Our best answer is a range, and the range is the point. Every one of them arrived in a window of at most 50 years, and probably far less. One deposit alone, the unit labeled Deposit 9, produced 1,906 human bone specimens, weighing more than 6 kilograms from at least 10 people. 2 of them were newborns. 2 were infants. The rest were adults. The skulls are the signature. Each one was struck along the midline so that the face, the jaw, and the vault split into near-mirror halves. And then, the top of the vault was trimmed around its edge into a shallow bowl. Archaeologists call the result a calotte. Some of the heads had been skinned before the blow landed. The calottes were found isolated and also stacked deliberately in groups. Below the neck, the treatment is butchery and nothing else. Skinning marks, disarticulation, marks, filleting marks, scrape marks where the membrane was cleaned off the bone, cuts on the mandibles in the position that means a tongue was removed, and cuts on the inner surface of the brain case. Percussion striae and anvil marks and conchoidal scars on the long bones with the breakage patterns tracking how much marrow each bone contained. Peeling on ribs and vertebrae, the rough fibrous fracture that fresh bone leaves when it is bent apart in 2 hands, which is exactly how the same community handled its cattle. There are 16 instances of chewing damage, and they cluster on the small bones of the hands and feet. That distribution is the argument for the chewer being human. A dog takes a limb away. A person sits and works through the fiddly parts in place. Isotopes from 8 sets of tooth enamel add the detail that makes this site genuinely frightening. 6 come from the processed bone concentrations, and all 6 grew up somewhere else on geology quite unlike the loess of the Rhine Valley. The 2 individuals who received a conventional burial at the same site were local. The pottery in the deposits comes from stylistic regions, hundreds of kilometers apart. 8 people is a very small sample, and the authors say so. But what we can see in it is that outsiders were being brought to Herxheim, and locals were not. What is a person doing 400 kilometers from home in a ditch in pieces? The problem is that the excavation's two leading figures have never agreed about the answer. Bruno Boulestein, who did the taphonomy, published the case for mass cannibalism in antiquity in 2009. Andrea Zieblans, who ran the site, prefers ritualized destruction. She describes it as the systematic breaking of bodies and objects, an act complete in itself with consumption and unproven extra. Jorg Orschiet and Miriam Heidel's osteology says the same. It points to a mortuary center, doing repeated secondary treatment of corpses. What's truly unsettling is that both readings need the same journey. Either way, hundreds of people came a very long way to a place in the Palatinate. They were taken apart there. We do not know whether they walked or were dragged. What the osteology does say is that these people did not die fighting here. The skull injuries that are present are old and fully healed. They are not wounds from the death event. So the enclosure sits there with hundreds of people in its ditches, brought from a long way off, over 2 generations, taken apart with the same technique the community used on livestock. Their skulls were turned into stacks of shallow bowls and left. Nobody can currently prove that anyone swallowed anything. Number 4. The shaft on the Mendip Hills. Charterhouse Warren Farm Swallet is a hole in the limestone of the Mendips in Somerset. It is a natural shaft about 15 meters deep. It is the kind of feature that opens where water has worked down through carboniferous rock for a very long time. In the 1970s, a group of cavers and amateur archaeologists went down it and started bringing things up. They brought up more than 3,000 human bone fragments. The material sat largely unpublished for decades. Then, in December 2024, Rick Schulting of Oxford and a team of 9 colleagues published the analysis in Antiquity. They gave it a title that inverts Steven Pinker's book on the decline of violence. The Darker Angels of Our Nature. Radiocarbon puts the deposit at between 2,200 and 2,000 years before the Common Era. Bayesian modeling gives a deposition window with a spread of at most a century and a quarter. The single most probable outcome is that everything went down that shaft in one event. At least 37 people. Men, women, and children, from newborns to the elderly. Older children and adolescents make up close to half the assemblage, which is not what an ordinary cemetery looks like, and is exactly what a catastrophe looks like. The first thing that happened to them was blunt force. Just over 30% of the cranial elements show perimortem fracturing, with the smooth-edged curvilinear breaks and internal beveling that only fresh bone produces. Of the 20 skulls, preserving part of the right eye socket 9 are fractured. There are no arrowheads anywhere in the deposit, despite the bow being in use for exactly this. Whoever did this stood close enough to swing. The second thing that happened to them is why they are on this list. 20% of all the human bones carry cut marks, and a quarter of the cranial elements do, made predominantly with stone rather than the metal that was available. Multiple cuts along the frontal bones are scalping. At least 5 mandibles have deep cuts on the front of the ascending ramus and long slicing cuts on the inner surface, which is a jaw taken off a skull and a tongue taken out of a mouth. 5 of the 12 complete first neck vertebrae and 6 of the 10 second neck vertebrae carry cut marks, which is decapitation. The ribs are cut on the outside and on the inside, which is defleshing and evisceration. Then the bones were broken. About a third of them show fresh fracture with percussion pits and conchoidal scars. On the thigh bones and upper arm bones, there is a pattern the authors single out as unusual. Both condyles, the paired knuckles at the end of the bone, have been snapped off with distinctive pits where the blows landed. Yellow marrow was taken from the shafts. Red marrow was taken out of the ends. Several ribs are bent and broken in the way a chest is forced open. A small number of hand and foot bones carry crushing damage of the sort flat human molars make, rather than the punctures a carnivore leaves. The authors are careful with this, and so should we be. It is the weakest strand in the paper, and it is the only strand that speaks directly to eating. What makes this entry genuinely nightmarish is a set of measurements that has nothing to do with butchery. Strontium and oxygen isotopes were run on 25 of the dead. All but 2 of them are local. These were not raiders from another valley, and they were not strangers. They lived there, And in the same shaft lie about 160 animal bones, overwhelmingly cattle, of which only around 6% carry cut marks against 20% for the humans. There was no famine. The cows were right there, and nobody bothered with them. Schulting and his colleagues are notably restrained about the last step. They describe a context of extreme violence and systematic corporeal insult, seemingly including anthropophagy, and they allow that the butchery may have mattered more than the eating, which could have been token. Their framing is that this was violence as performance, a community turning its neighbors into meat to demonstrate that they had never really been people at all. That mechanism did not die out in the Bronze Age. It is the oldest and most reliable engine of atrocity we have. It needs no shortage of food to start it, and every documented instance of it since has run on the same brutal principle. Establish that they are not like us. Then anything is permitted. Number 3, Gough's Cave. The object is a human forearm bone, a right radius, about 154 millimeters long, from a lightly built adult. Along the shaft in 4 regularly spaced clusters, someone cut a zigzag design, roughly 63 millimeters long, made up of 87 separate incisions. 33 were single strokes. 32 were made by sawing back and forth. 22 were scraped. Sylvia Bello and her colleagues at the Natural History Museum published it in 2017, and their microanalysis established 2 things. The engraving was done in one continuous session, and it was not butchery, because the marks are geometrically distinct from the butchery marks on the same collection. Then, the bone was cracked open for its marrow and chewed. Gough's Cave sits at the foot of Cheddar Gorge in Somerset. The human remains are about 14,700 years old, left by Magdalenian people moving north into a Britain emptied by the ice. There are at least 6 of them, including a child of about 3. The numbers from the modern excavation are extraordinary. 95% of the cranial fragments carry cut marks, and 46% carry percussion damage. Below the neck, 58% are cut marked, and 32% are broken for marrow. And 87 fragments carry human tooth marks, 42% of the assemblage. That is the one line of evidence we cannot explain away with any funerary rite that does not involve a mouth. The cut marks on the heads map out a procedure rather than a frenzy. The scalp taken off, the eyes removed, cheeks, lips, and ears cut away, the tongue cut out, the muscles of the neck detached. Then the facial skeleton struck off the base of the skull, broken away along a level plane, and the rim of what remained chipped back and regularized until the vault was a bowl. 3 of those skull cups came out of the cave, and they are the oldest directly dated examples anywhere in the world. But here is where the story stops being about one cave. In 2022, a genomic study of late glacial Britain found that the people at Gough's Cave belong to a population associated with the Magdalenian. They share ancestry with a specimen from Goyet. Their diet was entirely terrestrial, red deer horse, wild cattle with no marine signal at all. At Kendrick's Cave on the North Welsh coast, roughly 1,000 years later, the human remains come from a completely different population, one that ate heavily from the sea. Their dead were not modified by human hands at all. Kendrick's is a burial site with portable art in it. 2 peoples, 1 island. One ate its dead, the other buried them. It is the most unsettling comparison in British prehistory. Bello and William Marsh followed that up in 2023 by reviewing 59 sites across late Upper Paleolithic Europe. 13 show cannibalism, 10 show burial, 2 show both, and the 2 practices sort by culture. Cannibalism clusters with Magdalenian groups in northwest Europe. Burial with grave goods clusters with a different later population in the south and the east, except that this is a correlation between archaeological culture and mortuary practice. Ancient DNA is available for only some of the sites, so it should be held as an open question rather than a solved case. Paul Pettit has argued separately that hunger during the violent climate swings of the late glacial may still have played a part. The dichotomy between ritual and starvation is neater in a headline than it is in the ground. What the pattern does establish is the thing that reorders the whole subject. This was not an emergency. It was recurrent. It was localized. It was practiced by one cultural tradition, not its neighbors, and it was done to their own dead. Eating the dead was their funeral. Somewhere in that cave, a child of 3 was scalped, defleshed, opened, and chewed. By the standards of the people doing it, that was the correct and loving thing to do. The distance between that and anything you would recognize as a funeral is not a moral distance. It is a cultural one, and it is haunting precisely because it is so small. We can reconstruct every cut. We can put them in order. What we cannot recover is one word of what any of it meant. And there is nobody left to ask. Number 2. The hearth at Cowboy Wash. In the middle of the 12th century, a small farming hamlet on the south slopes of Ute Mountain in southwestern Colorado was abandoned in a hurry. The region was in the grip of a severe and prolonged drought. Ancestral Pueblo communities across the Mesa Verde area were failing, moving, and in places fighting. The site is cataloged as 5MT10010. It was excavated because the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, on whose land it lies, asked for a survey before an irrigation project went through. In 2 of the pit structures, there were 7 people, 4 adults and 3 older children, and no infants. In one structure, the bodies had been cut into small pieces and cooked in a pot. In the other, they had been cut into fewer and larger pieces and roasted on the hearth with the bones left on the floor and stacked on a bench. Elsewhere at the same settlement, 5 other people had been given ordinary formal burial. Everything so far is the same category of evidence as the rest of this countdown. Bones marks breakage, and every one of those things can be produced by violence, without anybody eating anything, which is the objection we have never been able to get around. How does anyone prove that a person ate a person? Then there is the 3rd structure. In the ash of its hearth, unburnt, lay a single human stool, 30 grams dry. What is remarkable about it is what is missing. Ancestral Pueblo people were maize farmers, and their preserved feces are full of plant material. This one had effectively none. No corn, no seeds, no starch granules, no phytoliths. It records a meal that was entirely meat-eaten somewhere between 12 and 36 hours before it was deposited. In 2000, Richard Marler and 4 colleagues tested it in the journal Nature for Human Myoglobin. Myoglobin is a protein specific to muscle tissue rather than blood, and it has no business being inside a human digestive tract unless a human ate muscle. The coprolite came back positive. 39 modern human fecal samples used as controls came back negative. 20 other prehistoric coprolites came back negative. 11 fragments of the cooking pot from that same hearth came back positive, and control sherds from other sites did not. What makes this the most consequential result in the entire literature is that it alone steps over the wall every other site runs into. Bones show processing. This showed digestion. It is the only time we have ever crossed that line, and it produced a crisis the discipline has still not fully worked through. The critique appeared in the same journal issue as the main archaeological report. Kurt Dongoski, then the archaeologist for the Hopi tribe with Deborah Martin and T.J. Ferguson, argued that the bone analysis examined a handful of variables where the standard method uses many more, and that roughly 3/4 of the assemblage had been reported simply as indeterminate fragments. They pointed to a road project in the same region where 3 similar-looking deposits turned out on closer study to be carnivore damage, ancient secondary burial, and dismemberment without any consumption. They offered an alternative in which captives were killed and hacked apart near fires, and surviving relatives then gathered what was left. And they made an argument that was not about taphonomy at all. The word cannibal was deployed by Columbus against the Taino as a justification for conquest. It has been used ever since to draw a line between peoples. That is an unsettling thing to read in a technical journal, and it is also accurate. The excavation team replied in print, and their central point holds. Osteology alone cannot demonstrate that anyone ate anything. A coprolite can. The strongest counter to that is equally simple and also holds. It is one coprolite. That argument changed how this work is done, and the change is the most useful thing we got out of it. The field increasingly writes about extreme processing rather than cannibalism. That phrase describes what is observable without asserting what is not. Descendant communities are now consulted as a matter of law and of practice, rather than informed afterwards, and remains from excavations like this one go back for reburial. And Terry Knight, the Ute Mountain Ute representative present at the excavation, gave the response that outlasts all of it. He did not deny the event. He said, as it was reported at the time, that like most civilizations, this one had good people who were productive and bad people who lived among them too. Number 1. The children of the Aurora Stratum. At the end of the 19th century, a mining company cut a railway trench through the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain. The line never carried a train. What it did was slice a set of ancient cave systems, open in cross-section, exposing meters of sediment that began accumulating long before our species existed. One of those exposures is called Grandolina. Partway down the sequence, there is a level labeled TD6. Inside it is a thin band the excavators named the Aurora Stratum. The sediment in that band was laid down while the Earth's magnetic field was still reversed before the last flip of the poles, which places it beyond roughly 780,000 years old. The Atapuerca team now works with a figure closer to 850,000. There is no older evidence of cannibalism anywhere on Earth. There is one older piece of evidence, showing hominins butchered other hominins. A shin bone from Kubifora in Kenya is roughly 1.5 million years old. It carries stone tool cut marks. It was published in 2023. Nobody can say which species used the tool, and so it doesn't settle anything. The people in it are not us. They are classified as Homo antecessor, a population sitting close to the last common ancestor of ourselves and the Neanderthals. Exactly where that sits is still argued over. Until this level was dug, nobody knew they existed. The first report in 1999 described 92 human specimens from 6 individuals. By 2010, the count had risen to at least 11. It is the composition that matters. 6 of the 11 were children. 4 of those were under the age of 4. 2 more were adolescents between 10 and 14. 3 were young adults under 20. There were no old people. The marks on them are unambiguous. They are entirely ordinary, which is the horrifying part. Cut marks appear at the base of the temporal bones and across the cheekbones where skin and flesh were stripped from the face. Peeling on ribs, vertebrae, and collarbones shows the rough, fibrous surface left when fresh bone is bent apart. It is like breaking a green twig between 2 hands. Percussion damage and chop marks appear on the limbs for marrow. Even the finger bones and the small bones of the feet were worked over. Carnivore marks are present on some of the bones, and their position settles the order of events. They lie on top of the human marks. People first, scavengers afterwards, and the animals butchered in the same layer. The deer and the horse and the bison were taken apart in exactly the same sequence. Skin fillet, dismember, break extract. Udald Carbonell and his co-authors published the interpretation in 2010, and it contains the most uncomfortable sentence in the field. This was not a crisis. It was habitual. It was, in their words, accepted and included in the social system of the group, a normal and repeated way of obtaining food that happened to use the neighbors. The same team has since argued that the victims were outsiders taken in territorial conflict, which is what the age profile suggests. Raiding parties kill the young of rival bands. The arithmetic complicates it, and that should be said plainly. Independent energy modeling of this exact layer found that despite being the most numerous single species in it, the humans supplied only about 1/10 of the available food. Set against the large mammals in the same deposit, the return was trivial. Nobody was doing this because it was efficient. The site keeps producing, and the newest material is not yet published. In 2025, the team announced the neck vertebra of a child of 2 to 4 with cut marks read as decapitation. In 2026, they announced the count had risen again to between 13 and 15 individuals, with adults now clearly among the dead. Both are field announcements rather than peer-reviewed papers, and we should hold them loosely. The truly disturbing part is that the caution runs in both directions. Michael Ponti, a taphonomist not involved in the excavation, and a co-author on that Kenyan shinbone, put the necessary objection on record. Cannibalism, he said, is very rare, and cutting a head off does not establish that anyone ate the body. So here is what the Aurora stratum actually holds. A few square meters of cave floor under a Spanish hillside containing 4 toddlers, 2 young children, 2 adolescents, and 3 young adults. All of them were skinned, filleted, and cracked open for marrow by people who had done exactly the same to deer. It happened on the same afternoon, in the same spot, with the same stones. And then they walked away. That is the beginning of the record, not the end of it. The record is thin, and the gaps in it are enormous, but the practice keeps surfacing through Neanderthal caves in France and Belgium, through the first farmers of Germany and Spain, through the Ice Age hunters of Somerset and Poland, into the Bronze Age, and out the other side. Every generation of archaeologists that has gone looking for the boundary where this behavior starts has found that there is no boundary, only older evidence. They did not want to find that. Villa's team said so on the first page in 1986 when they described their own field's reflex to reject the claim. Bullerstein and Zeblans still cannot agree about Herxheim, Schulting hedges on the eating at Charterhouse Warren. Bellow's review concluded in 2025 that the bones by themselves cannot even distinguish which kind of cannibalism is on the table. This is a discipline that has spent more than a century trying to make the evidence mean something else, failing honestly and publishing anyway. The bones are all still in museum drawers, cataloged and numbered. What is gone is every reason anybody ever had. And the oldest thing the record can tell you about your own species with any confidence at all is that we did not invent this. We inherited it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.